We'll wait another minute.
Sounds good.
I'll call the meeting to order for the Town of Colfax Plan Commission. Welcome, everybody. We'll take public comment after our special presentation on groundwater. So welcome, Chase and Heather. Thanks for joining us. And we've been talking a lot about the well water testing results last couple of months, and we've been hoping to have someone come in and talk with our group. And so thanks for joining us.
You bet.
And you can take it away whenever you're ready.
I can start, Heather. I'll just introduce myself and then you. And so my name is Chase Cummings. I'm the county conservationist here for Dunn County Land and Water Conservation. And also here today is Heather Wood. She is a conservation planner, water resource specialist for Dunn County Land and Water Conservation as well. Both of us are fairly new in our roles here at the county, but I'm hoping that our experiences can bring value to not only to this conversation, but to the county as a whole. I previously was the county conservationist for Pepin County for about 12 years and worked quite a bit with groundwater in the last 7-8 years. And Heather, I can let her expound upon her experience, but she comes in from the private sector with some wealth of information regarding water resources as well. So with that, tonight we have a presentation that Heather worked hard to kind of clean up that was information provided by DNR. And we're hoping to try to share some knowledge that we've gained regarding the town of Colfax. And by all means, are we not experts in all the areas that we'll discuss today, but we're a good resource here locally and would invite you to, if you have questions or further follow-up after this meeting, to reach out to us here in our office, and we'd be happy to try to answer any questions or help facilitate answers to those questions. So with that, Heather's gonna kind of lead the presentation, and then I can fill in any gaps or help answer any questions. So Heather, I'll turn it over to you.
Hey, thanks. Like Chase said, my name is Heather Wood. I'm the water resources specialist for Dunn County Land and Water. I come from the private sector, started here about June last year. I was primarily in lake management, so groundwater is a whole new world for me. And I've been doing a lot of learning in the past year. Like Chase said, this is a pretty a little bit of feedback. But this is a pretty zoomed out view, and I'm by no means an expert in the various things we're going to talk about tonight. But any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to contact me or Chase at Land and Water. So we'll start out here with some historic data. This is the town of Colfax. I want to say 86 and 87. The main takeaway here, if you look around at some of these spots, all of them are in decimals, and all of these are well below the enforcement standard of 10. The only exception being this one down here at 13, but it's the main takeaway is that it's a lot lower now, a lot lower than it is now. This is more of the current data. This includes the data that you all sent over to me, oh gosh, beginning of this year, as well as data from UW-Stevens Point and a variety of state resources. This map was put together by our land information department. And this is as zoomed in as it's going to be. This is by the section. So like you can see, most of Colfax, aside from the areas that we don't have the information, are under that 10 threshold. It's important to remember that even if you're down here in this section that has an average somewhere between 10 and 20, that doesn't inherently mean that your well is going to be testing high. That's just say, that could be anywhere from we only have 2 samples down there and both of them are high, or it could be we had one really, really high one that kind of skewed the average. So there's a number of factors to consider. This data is also a variety of ages. I think it dates back to, I want to say like 85 through 2021 with the data that you guys sent in. Over on the left here, you can see the averages for the data that we have available for the town of Colfax. And only about 8% of your wells have tested above the threshold of 10. That's not to say that, you know, that's all encompassing, that covers all the wells in the town of Colfax, because of course we know it doesn't. But this is where we're at to the best of our knowledge. The highest sample that we have on record is 18.2. And the average is 3.97. That is below the threshold of 10, but higher than the natural background rate of 2. Anything under 2, and we typically consider that to be just a natural level found within the water. So this is where things get a little bit noisy. We'll start up in the upper left-hand corner here, and this is just simply nitrate data over time, starting in 1982. And like the caption says, the trend is going up. Average nitrates are getting higher within the town. Now we'll move over to the upper right-hand side here. One of the things that's oftentimes tied to nitrate concentrations is well depth. Typically speaking, the deeper your well, the lower your nitrates. That's not, that's not a guaranteed slam dunk. It's not going to, just keep drilling until you're out of the nitrates, but it does reduce your risk. Down in the lower left-hand side here, we have the casing depth, and that is, the depth of the actual casing into the water table. Sometimes it's above the water table, sometimes it's below the water table. The casing depth is another factor that can really play into your nitrate concentration levels. Typically, the deeper... We got her? Okay. So typically, the deeper your casing depth is, the lower your nitrate's going to be. And again, none of these factors are going to be a guaranteed fix for all nitrate problems. These are all just contributing factors that can, add on to or help reduce your risk. The big thing that you're going to notice is this lower right-hand graph. So SWL stands for static water level, and that's where the top of your water table is. Now, sometimes, when you're drilling down, you hit bedrock and you're kind of forced to have your casing come down and be hanging out above your static water level. That's not great, but oftentimes, if you can get under that static water level with your casing, it's going to help. And that's what this red circle is pointing out here. The 0 line is the static water level. And so that's if your casing is touching the static water level. The negative numbers are for the casings that have to be put in above the static water level. And then these here are all casings that get drilled into the water table. So like you can see, when you're hanging out above the water table, you're going to see a lot more nitrates. If you're in it, the further in you go, the lower the nitrates get. And that's oftentimes because you're drawing older water. You're drawing water that the nitrates just haven't made it down to. So this is another thing that can impact your groundwater. And this is a very noisy map. They typically are. This is the elevation of the static water level, or the water table. We have to remember that groundwater isn't a static system. It's not just sitting there in one place. It's constantly moving and flowing. And typically speaking, the movement of the groundwater is going to be pretty similar to what you would expect on the surface. Not exactly to it, but most of the groundwater is going to be going towards some form of surface water. Now, in the case of Colfax, the majority of it is going to be moving in some way towards the Red Cedar River because that has a pretty strong draw. Now, there's going to be a little bit of a draw from 18 Mile Creek, but for the most part, the pull from the Red Cedar River is going to be a lot stronger. Down in the southeastern corner of the township, it might be moving down towards Big Elk Creek, but most of the town, as a general rule, is going to be going towards the Red Cedar River. Bedrock depth. So this is something, like I mentioned, if you're digging down, and I'm not a professional well driller, so I don't know the logistical feasibility of digging past bedrock for drilling wells. For the most part, in the town of Colfax, like you can see, it's going to be pretty shallow bedrock. There's not much that's any deeper than 50 feet. Most of it's under 5 feet. So you start digging, you hit bedrock, and you hope that your driller can get through the bedrock, basically. The geology of that bedrock is also important. There's a lot of different factors that impact your groundwater quality. So the bedrock geology, this is the entire state, and there's some spots where you have a lot of really good hard bedrock. Dunn County is not one of those places. Particularly in the town of Colfax, you can see it's almost entirely sandstone with some dolomite shale. I am not by any stretch of the imagination a geologist, but I can tell you that sandstone is a rather soft rock. It's quite porous, and so water, including water loaded with nitrates, can move through it pretty easily. That means that, you know, just because you're under the bedrock doesn't mean you're immune from nitrate contamination. So this is the land use, and this is what most people think of when they think of nitrate contamination. So if you look at the pie chart there on the right-hand side, you can see that agriculture actually isn't the biggest single use. It's actually grasslands. Now, that comes with the caveat that part of the grasslands in the data set that we use is actually like pasture lands or hay fields, alfalfa, stuff like that. I think it was about 10% of that 30% translates over to agricultural uses. So that means that about 38% of your land use in the town of Colfax is dedicated to agriculture. That being said, the primary nitrate loading is going to come from row crops. You know, your pasture fields, your grazing areas, your alfalfa fields aren't going to have, they aren't things that farmers typically apply nutrients to. They're not, you know, taking manure out there. They're not applying urea and stuff like that. So we're going to focus on that 28% of row crop land. Now, the last thing that can really impact your nitrate loading is going to be where you are in the landscape. Now, there's some places where your main water draw is going to be considered a recharge zone. So that's where water is entering the groundwater system. The other option is a discharge area, and that's going to be fairly close to the surface water. It's going to be where the water is kind of older, it's starting to come out. And this is where kind of all of those factors mentioned before come together. So we have this first one here, and these are all like hypothetical wells, just kind of demonstrate how the different factors can have different play. We've got some ag fields right here, and the water that this well is drawing is coming down through the recharge zone. So it's coming down through the agricultural land use. You know, they have been loading this with nutrients. That well is going to test pretty high. It's fairly close to the top. It's got fairly new water. It's going to be pretty high. Now this one right next to it, it has low nitrates, but that's mostly because it's deeper. It's still getting a lot of ag use water. It's still getting a lot of, you know, there's not much protecting it aside from that depth. And this dashed line is kind of the confining layer. That's your bedrock layer. So that helps filter out a lot of the nitrates. It's older water that it's drawing, so it's water that hasn't really been able to, that hasn't had nutrients exposed to it. Now over here, we have a well that is fairly close to the surface, much like our first high nitrate well, but it's still low nitrate, despite the fact that it's still in a recharge area. That's likely due to this forest land area that is upslope of where this water is drawing from. So a lot of the nitrates got filtered out before they got into this well, and now it's getting pulled up. Low nitrates. This one, the next one over, it is probably, if it was deeper, it would be getting older water, which would come from this land, this forested land use, but it's not. It's right near the top of the water table. It's right underneath agricultural land use, so it's getting newer water that's got a lot more nitrates in it. Now this last well is right where we start getting into the discharge area. So it's a low nitrate well because even though we have all of this agricultural land use upstream, it's getting older water because it's just deep enough and it's just close enough to the discharge area that it's not going to be getting the stuff that's coming in right here, because this is going to be following this flow line. It's going to be getting these year-old water that has been not exposed. Maybe it hasn't had as much, nitrogen applied to the land before the water entered the groundwater. And maybe it was forested years ago when the water that this is drawing from entered the system. So it's just, there's a lot of different factors that play in, and it's how those factors interact. This data is county-wide data. So this is kind of general data from basically as early as we can get through, I want to say 2020. Like you can see, the well depth county-wide, much like in Colfax, has been increasing. And that makes sense for a number of reasons. I mean, we're not doing dug wells anymore. I don't even think those are up to code. We're trying to get away from the nitrates. So the wells keep getting down deeper. And then we're going back to that casing versus static water level thing. And like you can see, the further down you get, the less nitrates you get. The further underneath your static water level, I should say. And this zero line is, again, the static water level itself. So these wells are all touching or near the static water level. And there's only one well that's above the 10 parts per million that is underneath, that's more than 100 feet underneath the static water level. Now, I imagine a lot of folks kind of wonder, well, what about these? They're hanging out 150 feet above the static water level. While I can't, guarantee I have any perfect answer for that, my educated guess would be that if your casing is hanging out 150 feet above the static water level, that's some pretty deep water you're chasing. So it's probably fairly old. It's probably been down there for quite a while. So you're not going to be getting a lot of the contamination that you would get in most cases where you're hanging out in that, 50 to 100 feet range. So this is kind of a summary, quick and fast summary of all of that information, all the different factors. We know that the vast majority of nitrates comes from agricultural inputs. From the solution perspective, we can't fix what happened in 1985. We can't go back and, take care of their over application of nutrients, but we can, work moving forward. Well construction, that's where the casing depth with the relativity of the casing depth relative to the static water level. And that is the most important factor. That's the most controllable factor. And that's the main thing we're kind of getting at here. With the first two factors that you see on this list, those are the only two that we have any control over. It would be a small miracle if we could, change the geology of the land. The location of the flow field, again, we can't change which way the direction the groundwater is going. I mean, I'm sure there is someone who would try if given a whole lot of time and money, but I'm not sure that would do much of anything. And then that last one, climate. We have to accept the fact that things like drought and floods are becoming more common, and nitrogen is a very water soluble nutrient, meaning that when it's dry, it just kind of gets stuck in the soil. It hangs out there. And then once we get, spring snow melt or a massive rain event, there's going to be a bit of a surge in the nitrogen concentration of a lot of the shallower wells. But we really need to kind of focus on what we can control. And for the prevention for the future end of things, that would be the land use, and working with farmers. And, a lot of them are doing good work, but we can't go back and fix what happened in 1985. And then working on getting good water now, that's where we go back to the well construction. Sometimes you have to dig a new well, sometimes you have to go deeper. It's just thinking of those things as we're building wells. So that's kind of the background of the groundwater itself. Now at the county level, we're actually trying to develop a program. And like Chase mentioned earlier, we're both somewhat new. I just started here last year, so we're trying to develop, we have bits and pieces throughout the county of a groundwater program, but we're trying to develop a more cohesive program. And so this is a bit of a summary of what we're hoping that program can become. Right now, at the county level, there is nitrogen sampling kits available for free through public health for expecting parents. That is completely out of the county's control. I believe that's a state program that is administered through our public health department. I believe a lot of other counties locally have comparable programs for expecting parents. But we also have kits available at both Land and Water and Public Health for anyone who wants to can stop in and get a kit. Now that comes with the caveat that once you get that kit, you're going to have to pay for it yourself. And that's about $60 if memory serves through UW Stevens Point, which is one of the kits we offer. We offer kits from UW Stevens Point, as well as kits from CTL, the Colfax, over in Colfax. Those, and I can't remember the exact pricing for CTL's testing, but like I said, for Stevens Point, I believe it's about $60. So it's just a convenience thing. You don't have to go through the hassle of ordering a kit. You can just pop into our office and say, hey, I'd like a kit. Tell us which lab and we'll hand you a kit with the slip to fill out. The other part of this program is going to be an information and outreach. So for general groundwater questions, what's causing my problem? I can't always answer it, but I can give you an educated guess or help you find answers to it. Feel free to reach out, contact me. For health-specific groundwater questions, that goes to public health. This entire program is kind of a partnership with public health. That being said, they're a bit busy at the moment with other stuff, given the state of the world. So I am the main contact point for most things groundwater related within Dunn County. The last thing, and this isn't up and running yet, but it is something that we're working on and hoping to have up ideally end of this year, beginning of next. It's kind of a one-stop shop for groundwater data, information, who to contact, the full map that I had on the second slide for the entire county with a summary of the groundwater data we have available. And that one, once it's available, is interactive, so you can go to your section and see how many, how many samples have been collected, what's the average, all that fun stuff. So this is just kind of a frequently asked questions. When should I test my well? The 15 months thing is to try and catch the seasonality of it. If you're doing it every 15 months, after 4 years, you're gonna have it, one for the summer, one for the spring, one for the fall, one for the winter. So that way you can kind of see if there's any, am I getting really high nitrates in the spring? So that way you're aware. If you notice or suspect any changes or problems, you should probably get it checked. And that's where, especially if it's a smell, I would suggest going the bacteria route as well. Because nitrates don't smell. You can't see them. They're, completely soluble. With that mapping data, and this one I actually got from before getting the data from you guys, what happens to the data I share? So if you send us your well data, we don't put it on the website for anyone to search, I want to look up so-and-so's well. The data that's available online is an aggregate form. It's basically a giant spreadsheet that's running in the background of that map. Now, that being said, anything that comes into us is public record. And so we respect privacy and are not going to make it easily accessible. But if somebody comes in and they give us a formal public records request, we're going to have to work with our corp counsel to get them the data that we are legally obligated to, because we are a unit of government. What can I do if my well has high nitrates? This goes back to the variety of factors, and it really, the first step would be to determine why it has high nitrates. Is it, too shallow? Is it the farmer upland is putting way too much manure on his field? But at the end of the day, short of drilling a new well, water treatment systems, there's reverse osmosis systems, and that's probably the most common. There's, I want to say, ionization. And correct me if I'm wrong on any of that, Chase. There's a whole variety of systems that you can use to treat your water to help pull out the nitrates. I don't think there's really any that can get it down all the way down to zero, but the reverse osmosis systems, I believe, work up to, I want to say 30-ish.
27. Yeah.
27. Yeah, so they'll get you under that 10 as long as you're not above 27. And then for more information, there is a ton of information, on the internet. The two main ones are through the DNR, and then UW Stevens Point has loads of information, all kinds of, pamphlets and informational packets and whatnot, all at the click of a button. I think that's all I have for slides. Yep.
And if I could, Heather, I'll just add a few kind of closing remarks. Heather spoke a lot on nitrates, and I think that was part of the main focus of the water tests that were conducted within the town of Colfax. And nitrates are often typically viewed as an indicator nutrient. So typically they're cheap and easy to test for. And if high nitrates are present in a water sample, the question then we have to ask is what other potential contamination is with it. And that's where you can get into more source testing, looking at sources of nitrate. So whether that's agriculture, whether that's septic systems, whether that's other forms of nutrients that are applied to the land, or you can also look at the sources through whether that's animal agriculture or commercial agriculture. Heather mentioned a lot about agriculture in this presentation, and that's not without thought. The main reason is that the largest land use in the county, the largest land use in particular township of Colfax is close to agriculture. So when typically across the state, when we see areas where wells have contamination. Unfortunately, they are located near areas of high intense agriculture. That's not to say that wells don't become contaminated from other sources, such as industrial land application or private septic systems through the development of subdivisions and things like that. But in general, especially with our work in the Land and Water Conservation Department, as we're looking for those land use changes that have the greatest impact on the water resource. Nitrates typically in any given time they can fluctuate. So the importance is when you're trying to interpret well data is to look at the individual wells, and that's partly why Heather spent a lot of time talking about well casing depth, well construction and location. Is that we can have a nice pretty map that's presented with some averages for wells that have been tested across the township or across the county. But when it really comes down to determining whether or not your particular individual well is going to have contamination, you need to look at that individual well on its own basis, on its own merits, and with those unique criteria. From a planning standpoint, and recognizing that this is the Town of Colfax Planning Commission, looking at averages of nitrates and well and drinking water contamination across the township, we can look at some of the larger averaging and larger aggregate data. But when it really comes down to an individual trying to make a decision for their own personal well, a closer look needs to be had. And I think a lot of the time Heather spent talking about wells is important because oftentimes individuals are contacting us or public health wondering what they can do about their well that is already contaminated. And groundwater is kind of a sneaky thing and it's really hard to put your thumb on it. It's not visible as often as surface water is, so it's harder to understand and sometimes harder to interpret. We need to try to pay attention to those individual wells and provide recommendations. So if a landowner really wants to address the contamination in their well, there's a series of options, and Heather mentioned treatment as an option to try to get an immediate response and immediate protection, if you will, from contaminated drinking water. The other options are looking at those well constructions, and are there ways that we can construct our wells to have a deeper casing that can, based on the data that DNR has provided, and which is from across the state as well as this particular township, can we put our well casings deeper into the water table to try to pull older water to have lesser nitrates? Those are some options to try to have a fix, a more immediate fix. Now, all that is said with the understanding that doesn't really condone the continued contamination of groundwater. That's where our work also comes into play is, how do we work with the users of the landscape to try to mitigate losses of nitrogen. Agriculture is a leaky system, and that's just by nature what it is. Nitrogen is a leaky nutrient. We could apply nitrogen to a crop field at all the rates that are recommended and follow all the rules, and we could get a rain event that could leach that nitrogen away. So part of our work is going to continue to try and limit and work with land users and local units of government to try and mitigate that loss of nitrogen over time. And if you follow at all some of the work that's being done with some of the ag performance standards, particularly Administrative Code NR 151, is looking at a targeted performance standard for nitrate across the state and looking at ways to mitigate nutrient application of nitrates to lessen the burden on groundwater and drinking water. So there's a number of things to try to remember when we're trying to address nitrates and ultimately all groundwater contamination is how do we get an immediate fix for someone who needs safe water, which is more of an infrastructure type of a mitigation. more so than when we're looking at land use changes and land use management. We're trying to plan for the long term. Heather mentioned, a deeper casing into the water table is probably pulling older water. How do we make sure that that older water for the next generations ahead or after us isn't going to be contaminated as well. So we didn't really get into the public health impacts of nitrate and why nitrates particularly are of concern. So we certainly can try to have that conversation if you would like, but in general, we are an agricultural society. A lot of the work we do is pertained and focused to agriculture, which in this case for groundwater contamination, likely is a primary source for where nitrates are coming from, what is being applied to the land. But again, we still need to make sure when we interpret an individual well that we consider all the factors. And in some cases, septic systems may be that source as well, because I know that is a common discussion point of where those nitrates are actually coming from. So I know I kind of rambled on a little bit more there, but I just want to make sure I tied a bow on a few points. And Heather did a good job putting this together. There's some good information there, especially at these links. And like we said, we're here for additional resources and hopefully to have a continued conversation here. So I know we didn't cover it all, and there's maybe some unanswered questions, and we'll do our best to try to acknowledge those and answer them today.
And just a note, if you guys want, I can send you the slides themselves if that's something else that you wanted included for, you want to make it available for folks to be able to access. Happy to send them over.
I think we have the slideshow from a couple of months ago.
That is the slideshow that I based this off of.
Oh, okay, I see. Say,
This
Heather,
is a heavily modified version.
Can you go back to one of the second or third slides showing the well data squares in the township?
This one?
No, go back further. That one.
That one? Okay.
So, is there a pattern here? What? Why the vertical yellow running up north and south through the township? This density of the samples that were done, or Chase, what's going on there?
Yeah, I can maybe give a few thoughts on that. If you can kind of see through the transparency of the coloring, you'll see County Road M through there. I think that's a very good point, Paul, on interpreting this map. And to our point before is that this can give us a general understanding, but we really need to look at it closer. And County Road M, looking at density of homes, residences that are along that county road or businesses, and looking at where the samples were collected. It might be coincidence that all those homes are along County Road M and they all tested high. That could be why that's colored yellow. I think we need to look at even further into this and look at not only the number of samples that are collected. Heather mentioned that earlier. We could have one sample in one of those sections that just so happened to have tested high, and maybe it was just maybe it was a really shallow well. It was in a poor location. It had unfortunately a really high intense land use around it, and it makes that whole section look bad, where a neighbor could drill a well or get tested and it be completely different. It's all going to be unique. I kind of spent some time looking at the specific data for the samples you collected in 2020 and early 2021. And there's other overlays that we can do with mapping to look at soil type, bedrock depth, look at recharge areas, look at the land cover type. I think all those are factors that come into play when we need to interpret this. So like Heather mentioned, this is a really good map to kind of give you an idea. But if we really want to look at trends and look at details, we'll need to drill down deeper. And I think that information can be available to the public. But in a general map like this, it's hard to really put all that into context and display it. So like I mentioned, when I looked at some of your well results from most recently looking at recharge areas. Many of those areas that tested high or above the safe drinking water standard of 10 were areas that were very good to excellent recharge. And you have soils that, especially in Colfax area, that are very sandy, Plainfield sands, Aldo sands, Kevlar sandy loams or loamy sands. Those are all highly permeable, and leaching potential is very high for those. So management of nutrients is even more important. So I guess I know it's a kind of a long-winded answer, Paul, but I think there's definitely some density considerations there that, like you mentioned.
Sure.
I'd like to follow up on that a bit, because this map shows historical averages, and the height, when you were talking about looking at our most recent data, it's a little different than what this map would indicate. And so it'd be nice if we could get trends over time so we can see where things may be changing or things may be getting better or where they may be getting worse. You talked about currently our tests are in high recharge. When you think about that, two questions for you about that. What are the implications for subdivision development given that? And also, what do we know about how quickly, let's say this is high recharge, those and I'm talking only now about our current testing, which the map would look a little different than this, but in our current testing, and those people who have high nitrates, and let's say the land use, we know many farmers are trying to do the very best they can to reduce the nitrate levels. Do we have any sense of how long it takes with improved nitrate applications for the nitrate levels to change? So two questions buried in that.
Yeah, I guess I would say, to answer your last question, Kathy, I don't think we know how long it takes to clean a well up if we were to change the land use overnight or in a series of years or time. I think it's all dependent on the unique situation. There's people working on that. There's people looking at through lysimeter work, research within, looking at subsoils and leaching and what type of land use practices we can implement to change that. There's plenty of research that's been done to show how much nitrogen is leaching from different systems, whether that's a corn, soybean system to a perennial system such as CRP land, and also in comparison to septic tanks and septic drain fields, I should say, and their proximity or their density. I don't remember if I got your first question right, but I did remember you mentioned something about looking at long-term trends, and just looking at the most current data. And I think Heather mentioned that, and you did as well, Kathy, that this current data here is, we could have something from 1980 all the way till now, or you could have one well that's always high and they've got 10 samples that are being tested, so it's always going to be elevated. But if you look at just the most recent data, Heather mentioned the 2 milligrams per liter as kind of the background level. Anything above 2 is considered the preventative action limit within the NR 140, which is administrative code for groundwater quality. So in theory, anything above 2, we're supposed to be taking preventative action on. And right now, within those most recent samples, the 0 to 2 milligrams per liter, so beneath that preventative action limit, you had 13 samples that met that criteria. Therefore, that's about 40, just shy of 45% of the wells, which is a good sign. Between 2 and 10, so that whole preventative action limit area, 10 being the safe drinking water standard, you had about 34.5% of the wells tested within that range. And then above 10, or above the safe drinking water standard, you had 6 wells and those about are just shy of 21% of the wells tested exceeded that safe drinking water standard. So as you mentioned, Kathy, those numbers are different than what you see in the overall aggregate data. A suggestion that I have considered suggesting, I guess, it's one that I, in my experience working in Pepin County, started to implement over the last 5 or 6 years, was trying to get a better handle on the trends within those wells and within the particularly county or township. We had a groundwater monitoring program set up where we were sampling one well per government section, and we were doing that once every 5 years. And the plan would be that, every 5 years we would come back and sample that exact same well. It'll be a well that we knew the well construction on, and we could look at trend analysis based on that. So, if we want to look at how do we plan in the future for assessing our resource, that's one consideration. And that's a much easier said and done undertaking in Pepin County than it is in Dunn County, as far as just the number of sections and a number of wells. So I don't know if I answered your first question, Kathy, and maybe you can remind us of what that was, but.
Well, I'm just thinking about in terms of the Plan Commission and listening to some of the issues that they have to deal with on a regular basis for CSMs.
Oh,
sure. And you were saying that the current, what you were seeing in the current data or the current well testing data is that the problem seemed to be in, I think it was high and excellent recharge. Am I putting words in your mouth, Chase?
Good to excellent recharge areas.
Good to excellent.
In general.
So where do we go with that, or where does the Plan Commission go with that information?
Right. I guess my limited experience here in Dunn County has exposed me to the long conversation of the land division ordinance with at the county level, and kind of watching where that's going. The best information I have available is some of the research that's been done and aggregated by others, and looking at densities, and it's approximately 0.6 of an acre density for septic drain fields on a 20-acre parcel is equivalent to a 20-acre field of corn. So, that's a pretty tight density. And, when we look at CSMs or plats or land development, the conservationist side of me, does feel like we should pay attention to that resource and that land use, and the characteristics of that land in those considerations. So I guess I'm cautious to really have a silver bullet in how we approach that. But I think consideration needs to be given to the recharge areas, to the soil types, but then also to consideration for well construction. There's a well code in the state for constructing wells, but are there recommendations that we as a municipality, whether at the township level or the county level, could provide? Maybe they're not legally able to be requirements, but could they be recommendations to provide, you're going to be in this area, and we would suggest that you have a casing depth of X to reduce your risk. This is not again, we have to be careful from the legal aspect. It's not a guarantee. There is no guarantee in constructing a well that you're going to have safe drinking water, for nitrate purposes. It's, but I guess that's kind of a roundabout answer to your question, Kathy. I think it's a challenge, and I don't know what the right response is, other than we do need to consider the land use. We do need to consider the static things that Heather mentioned, the geology, the soils, some of those things that we don't have control over. What we do have, the things that we do have control over is where we need to spend our efforts.
I can steal another, I don't want to steal other people's time, but in another question, in a night, I should be up on this and I'm not. I know that there is some money that is available for people whose well have been found to be high in nitrates, that they can get a well replacement. Do you, and I think they were trying to change the legislation to make that a little bit more of a generous consideration. Do you remember, or do you have that information about where, you know, what that program offers?
Yeah, Heather and I, we talked about this. We knew that maybe this question would come up, and we, I guess I didn't get around to looking at the current status of it. And Heather, jump in if you know more, but
Yeah, I can actually
go
answer
ahead, yeah.
this one if you want. Yeah, Kathy, like you said, they're working on it, but the status of it right now is it's a DNR program. I can't remember the exact name, well replacement. And it has income considerations. The maximum household income is $65,000 a year. And I hesitate to call it a problem, but it is that for nitrate contamination, the water source has to be for both potable drinking water as well as livestock. So if you don't own livestock and it's nitrate contamination, you're out of luck. But there is other contaminants that it doesn't have the livestock requirement for, arsenic, I believe bacteria, stuff like that. But those are the two main things for nitrate contamination. I think they are working on getting rid of the and, so both requiring both a household water source and livestock water source. And that livestock water source has to be providing at least, I believe it's 100 gallons a day to livestock in order to be eligible for well replacement for nitrate contamination. I think they're trying to get rid of the and language, but I don't know exactly where that sits at this moment.
I know it was, we were also trying to put money into that program as well as raise the income threshold to make more people eligible for it. But I believe that was, well, that was part of the Water Quality Task Force recommendations back in 2019. It had a lot of traction amongst other water quality bills that were ultimately adopted by the assembly, the state assembly, but were not taken up by the Senate in time before COVID hit. And then that legislative session went out or ended, and a lot of those measures were not brought up. Some of it was brought up through the most recent governor's budget, but then ultimately they did not make it through to the final budget that was signed. So I'm sure there's people that are still working on that, and I think it's a necessary program that a lot of people are unfortunately have to deal with the consequences of that unsafe water, and they don't have the means to afford a new well or some sort of treatment.
Can I ask a question? Chase and Heather, thank you for coming. I've been pushing groundwater for I don't know how many years. In fact, whether you're aware of it or not, our comprehensive plan was based on groundwater, the town of Colfax. Okay. The biggest problem I have as a Dunn County citizen is where's the enforcement and who covers what? I would like to see a diagram of what the county can do and what the DNR can do. A good example of this is I witnessed a high capacity well installed in the village of Colfax on County M. And at that time, there were crops coming, so the corn crop was all chopped. It's gone. I'm going to assume that somebody's going to put in an irrigation system right within the village of Colfax. And I contacted the local DNR office, and he agreed with me. And I even got the information from the groundwater website with the DNR, and I can pretty much tell how deep it is, who it is, and it's zone general ag within the village of Colfax. And I can almost guarantee that why would you put a 650 gallon per minute well within the village if you weren't going to use it. And this brings me to the modern farming or the industrial farming, which I call it, or some people call it CAFOs. That well, I'm sure was tested when it was installed, but where do we go from there? And what happens if that land was part of a CAFO expansion and they want to get rid of their liquid manure, which happens with these CAFOs in the spring and in the fall? And Heather or Chase, you had mentioned that, well, when things are dry, that nitrogen just kind of sits there. And also I heard 18 Mile Creek, when I checked in it with the DNR, they said, I said, what about the groundwater and the level? And they said their only concern, the DNR told me, was the levels of 18 Mile Creek. So they're going to use 18 Mile Creek as a gauge of how much water that well uses. I don't know if you can see where, who's going to be monitoring the 18 Mile Creek? Is the county going to monitor it? Is the state going to monitor it? The more I try to find out information between the DNR and the county, I get so frustrated I can hardly talk because I can give you so many examples. And another example, I live on 830th Avenue and there's a subdivision just kitty corner south of me. Now the town of Colfax is a 5-acre minimum for a lot. Well, that 5-acre minimum seems to be very popular, and popular to the effect that I know a residential that purchased 2 5-acre lots, and there's corn on one, and there's another lots in it to have corn on. And so if we start talking about nutrient management plans and who has and who has not, does not have to, you're as far as I'm concerned, it's a mixed bag of worms, because I assume a farmer is planting the corn on these residential lots. And when you can get nitrates, if it isn't farmland, it could be septic systems. And lo and behold, I'm so glad the town of Colfax went with a 5-acre minimum for residential building. So you guys have a hard job coming up, because like Heather talked about, what can we do in the 1985s? Well, I'd like to know the number of CAFOs there were in 1985 compared to 2021. Maybe that's information you can find. But I see huge problems, especially with the drastic changes in our climate change and our weather. I don't know if there's anything you can answer, but I do think a responsibility, kind of like an organizational chart, where do we go as private citizens when we want to address this issue? Does the county have any enforcement, or is the enforcement at the DNR? That type of graph would save me a lot of time. As
Yeah,
an individual citizen.
Sorry, Terry. Yeah, there's a lot there. I guess I share in your frustration maybe to some degree, because I think it's hard for us too to navigate a lot of the rules and administrative codes that may or may not affect us as a land and water conservation division, but much less a county or a municipality. What I can add is the authorities that we have at the county level are not necessarily as great as what the authorities that may be granted to a township. Townships typically have more ability to establish ordinances, establish other mechanisms to achieve the goals that the town has. With that said, the county does have some authorities as well, and if you followed the update to the county's manure storage ordinance, hopefully that was expressed as far as the county is. We are limited to the authorities that are granted to us by the legislature, and that legislature at the time put some requirements, some sideboards on the operation and implementation of those authorities. So, for example, we have an administrative code that is NR 151. That is a state administrative code that's administered by the Department of Natural Resources. That's where your ag performance standards and prohibitions come into play, your nutrient management planning, your over application of nutrients, overtopping of manure storage structures, cattle access to certain bodies of water, a number of other things. And the DNR has that authority, but typically that authority or the implementation for that authority is passed down to the county. And the county is the implementation arm for the Department of Natural Resources when it comes to that. Now, the county does have, through the Land Conservation Committee and state statute, has the ability to adopt ordinances, and that's of which they have done in the past through the manure storage ordinance, and now most recently this updated ag performance standards and manure storage and management ordinance. What that ordinance does is it has adopted the administrative code of NR 151 into county ordinance, which then does provide a more clearer picture for us as staff and hopefully for the public as to where the authorities lie within the county when it comes to some of those particular items. With that said, some of those sideboards and restrictions that have been granted as a part of the authorities by the legislature is that we must offer cost share in a lot of situations. Anything that is considered new, and new is after October 1 of 2002, typically, we do not have to offer cost share for. But anything that is existing prior to 2002, which a lot of cases our cropland was existing at that time, many of our facilities were existing at that time, we need to offer cost share, which does provide some incentive as well as some mitigation strategy to achieve compliance, but it also is limiting because there's only so much money that goes around to provide cost share. To your point on water quantity, well construction, there are mechanisms through the county for well construction, obtaining permits, but ultimately the quantity portion of it and some of the greater monitoring of those impacts is beyond the county at this point. That's at the state, and unfortunately we don't have anything set up at this time. And I know that's not a may not be an acceptable answer, but I do think that there are considerations for towns in what authorities you may or may not have to address some of these issues is something that should be looked at. And I don't have all those answers right now, but to provide a diagram of who does what, we could give a simplified version probably, but I'm afraid that it would get very complex in a hurry, just based on all the intermingling of different agencies and who does what, where does funding come from. So I don't know that that's feasible to be a complete accurate description, but certainly we could give what I just explained as far as a general. The county is very limited to some respects on what we can and cannot regulate.
In the past 2 years, I've contacted certain committees like the PR&D committees and other committees. And I've been really looking forward to this groundwater website. And that was one of the things that came out of your ad hoc groundwater committee. And I even contacted personally the GIS people in Madison who run a groundwater website. And I talked to this lady and she told me, certainly we share our data with other entities. And I made this I even sent this to Tom Quinn, who's the chair of the PR&D committee. But I haven't heard whether the Dunn County is going alone on the GIS part or whether they're going to replenish more data in this. My fear is when you do come out with that website, there'll be a lot more questions. And I thought I'm a good one not to reinvent the wheel. I think government does that too much. And I thought if you could work with the DNR groundwater data or whatever, and populate or let's just say add or enhance to the Dunn County groundwater website, I think this would be more beneficial because you could get.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Terry. I'll let Heather kind of talk a little bit of the details of our particular map, but in general, my experience on some other working groups in the state has been a shared sentiment across counties, is that how do we better share data? So we're looking at, everyone can look at the same picture. So is through the groundwater retrieval network, which is DNR's system for tracking data, through the State Lab of Hygiene, can that be shared with all the samples that go through Stevens Point and their water and environmental analysis lab? Unfortunately, if you're not a public lab, so take Colfax, for example, as a private lab, they're typically, just due to client privileges, they're not sharing that data unless it's through a government program.
Right.
So, unfortunately, we don't have the full picture in a lot of cases, but I'll let Heather explain this map. And I think your questions, I think she can answer it based on where this data is coming from for our map. So yeah, Heather, if you will. Yeah.
Yeah, so on this map, there is, of course, the 20 samples that we got from you folks up in Colfax the end of last year and this year. There's 102 other samples that have come from a variety of sources. One of those sources being, the folks at the state saying, hey, can we get the data that you have for Dunn County, and sending us this. To your point of reinventing the wheel, we're not trying to. A lot of the stuff that we're doing, even down to a lot of the formatting, is being pulled from UW Stevens Point statewide map that is similar to this. We have the added bonus of having some more localized data. I have gotten a couple of lab slips from Colfax, and as Chase mentioned, because of they're a private company, they're not obligated to share their data with us. The only way we get data from private labs is if somebody physically sends me their lab slip, and then I enter the data and I send it over to our GIS folks, and they get it popped into the map. This map does have a pretty wide variety, and that's where a lot of the age problems come into question, because we do have some older data in here. This is from statewide databases. This is from data that we have on file. I've gotten some of the data from a couple of our farmland watersheds when they do watersheds or groundwater sampling. So it's kind of coming from wherever we can get good quality data.
Yeah, I would add to that too, that my optimistic view is that I would think in the long term that our well water viewer for Dunn County could be the primary location for the most accurate and up-to-date data. That being, the reason I say that is that our GIS department is going to continuously pull and query the state's resources. So we're going to constantly continue to update our map based on what the state has. So if someone in Dunn County sent a sample to the State Lab of Hygiene, but didn't send it to us, eventually we would get that into our system. We might not know who it is or any other details on it, but it is a data point that would be brought in. Right now, the well water viewer out of UW Stevens Point is becoming, and if not already, the hub for all of the data that's available from the public labs within the state. So that also being, let's say, the public health lab up from Eau Claire or La Crosse or Marathon County. Those labs are all sending their data in through the State Lab of Hygiene, which goes through the groundwater retrieval network and then into the well water viewer for Stevens Point. So why I say I think ours could even be better is that, like Heather just mentioned, there may be citizens that got a sample back from a private lab, let's say CTL, and chose to provide it to us, and we could incorporate it into our database where it might not be incorporated into the larger state database. So again, that's an optimistic view from my point, and maybe hopefully not a pipe dream in the long run. But I think to your point and to your question, Terry, I think this, we are, while not reinventing the wheel completely, like Heather mentioned, the formatting is almost identical to Stevens Point's well water viewer. I think we could be that hub for Dunn County residents. And part of the delay in our release of this is, for one, we needed to do a little bit more legal review just to make sure we had our public records requests and how procedures in place of how we would handle that. But also, Heather really made strong arguments and points to making sure we have context with the information. So Terry, you mentioned, when we release this, we might be getting a lot of questions, and I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's what Heather's really working on now. And part of the delay in our release of this is we can put this map up there, and to all the comments that we've made earlier tonight about, yes, it might be yellow, or yes, it might be orange on the map, but it doesn't mean that your particular well is going to be that color or have that contamination. We need to provide that context on the website as well. We need to provide the links for all of the other sources of information and who to contact and how to interpret a well result, how to interpret a well construction report, things like that. So, we're not going to have it all in there by the time we want to. We'll continuously improve that website. And we also know that, individuals likely might not read all that context, and they're going to be calling us anyway. But our hope is that we can meet the requirements or the request the recommendations of the groundwater ad hoc committee, and put something out there that's that we can stand behind and try to help people understand their water quality in Dunn County if they so choose to care.
Well, this is good. This is a good test, because right on my road going off on 940th Street, there's a brand new home going up, and not a mile, just down to the end, take south a ways. I've got 2 new homes going up in the area I live right now. And I can tell what progress of the construction by the type of utility vehicles that go by. So I'm just curious to see how as an individual, I can access this well information, because I assume whoever drills their wells has to file a something or a test with the state somewhere. Am I wrong?
That's correct. Any new well now must have a nitrate and bacteria test as part of it. So that will be typically, that is sent to is part of the State Lab of Hygiene. It'll be part of the groundwater retrieval network that DNR has. Yeah. So we individually here in Dunn County may not know what that particular well sample result is without actually looking for a well construction report and a sample if it's available. But it will eventually be incorporated into our mapping data set. We won't be able to pull out, where's Terry Nichols as well, and you won't have that access from our website. But you certainly could pursue that potentially if available through other means.
Exactly. Thank you.
Looking at, I want to circle back to, and other people may have questions, but I want to circle back to your question, to your comment about nitrates. I've heard the nitrate testing is sort of the canary in the mine kind of test. If somebody has a high nitrate level, as we know 21% of our recent sample did, are you recommending, or do you have thoughts about if they should have further testing? I know some of the people who did have high tests did get RO systems. But do you have thoughts about whether testing should go further than that? We asked UW Stevens Point about that, and they were about doing source testing, and they said it's really not necessary because most of it does come from ag. So, but should they be doing further testing for other contaminants?
Yeah, I guess I'll let Heather express her thoughts too. But from my perspective, I think if we are involved with a landowner that has had questions about water testing, or we help facilitate a water test, and it comes back with a high, either exceeding the enforcement standard or at the very least exceeding the preventative action limit, we will express those options that they have. You know, it's their choice as to how far they want to pursue it. You know, I think to your comment of what Stephen's point relayed to you is, you know, if you are located in a land use where you look out your window and you see corn and beans, you know, the likelihood of your nitrate contamination is probably coming from that type of land use. If you look out your window and you see houses all on individual sanitary systems, you know, maybe you would have a reason to believe that it's not that. You know, individuals that may still be curious, I would recommend that they follow up with it. You know, they could do the pharmaceuticals, personal care products test. They could do a DACT screen, a trizine scan as initial thing, and then you could pursue even further, you know, ag chem type follow-up if you really want to know what's in there. You know, I guess I would encourage that if people have the funds to do that. We, at this point in time, we don't have money available for that. Now, with that said, Heather and I have spent some time talking about, you know, continuously improving our groundwater monitoring program to where if and when we have the opportunity to obtain some grant funds, what are we going to do with them? And how are we going to implement a testing program? And then maybe at that point in time, we would have a program that could have an initial test. And then if it comes back at a certain threshold, maybe we would offer to pay for a source test as well. But I think when it really comes down to it, if people are concerned about their high nitrates or potential other contamination, you really need to look at how you treat that water, whether that's drilling a new well or reverse osmosis, and making sure that an RO system will treat everything else that may be along with that nitrate contamination, which then circles back to, well, how do you know what's in that water unless you test for it? So I would say in general, I would encourage anybody that wants to pursue further testing to do that. Obviously, they're going to have to do that on their own dime. But it's a, you know, if you don't know, you don't know how to react to it. So.
Yeah, yes, kind of echo what Chase said. I mean, if you were up in Bayfield County and you got high nitrates, then you should probably do some source testing, but we're not. We're in Dunn County, and this is a very agricultural area. The folks at Stephen's point, they're probably right. If you're curious, go for it. You know, the more you know type of thing. If you're looking outside and you've got nothing but forest around you, maybe it could tell you if, you know, maybe you've got a leaky septic system or a failing septic system, but the vast majority of nitrates in this area are from ag inputs. It's not to say that, you know, it couldn't be septic inputs. It's just saying, you know, if you don't want to spend the money to do the source testing, it probably is.
We have a question.
What?
We have a
Yes.
question.
No, I have a question for Chase. How much does it help to put a stabilizer when you put nitrogen on your farmland?
Yeah, good question, Gary. So I have some information on that here someplace. So, you know, nitrification inhibitors, other stabilizers like that are a tool in the toolbox, and they have, you know, they have a place, and we need to, you know, use those when available. A lot of the research looking into that is the percent nitrate reduction from a nitrification inhibitor is around 9%. So it does have an impact. When you look at split application of nitrogen, you know, so not front end loading your nitrogen all at plant or pre-plant of a crop, spreading that nitrogen application out also has an impact. that can range anywhere from 5 to 7% reduction in nitrogen. So they do have impacts. But they're relatively low in comparison to some of the other tools in the toolbox, such as cover crops. Looking at rye cover crop, for example, you're looking at about a 31% nitrate reduction. Moving even further up in the toolbox would be looking at perennial vegetation such as CRP land. As you would expect, there's no nutrients being applied to that, and you have perennial vegetative cover there. You're looking at like an 85% reduction in nitrate leaching. So the other aspect that I think really has some merit and some consideration is split application, use of nitrification inhibitors if able, cover crops in rotation, but then also extended rotations. And extending your rotation, to have at least 2 years of some sort of perennial crop like alfalfa or something else, a full season cover crop, in a 4 or 5 year rotation, that can have another layer of percent reduction. Now I say that with the thought in mind that we can apply all these best management practices, but we still could have those instances where we're losing nitrogen and nitrate in the system. And there's just some things that we're not going to be able to play our best management practice hand to its fullest and correct all of that. So we got to look at soil health is a big thing, incorporating, making sure we have higher organic matters to retain nutrients so that the way they're not leached out in the soil. So, I think there's a number of things that we need to consider. And to your point of nitrification inhibitors, some of the other urease inhibitors, some of the other nitrogen management tools, they are a tool, but they are not a silver bullet on their own. They need to be part of a system. Really, to be honest with you, I think in some instances, in some cases, not actually cropping the land is really your silver bullet. And we know in the state of Wisconsin, in particular Dunn County, that's not a popular view, and nor am I advocating for that in all circumstances. But if we have a particular well or public well, in particular, let's say a rural church or something that has high nitrates, are there ways that we can mitigate that? Well, there's a suite of tools there, and one of them may be land out of production. So I guess I'll leave it at that. I would also, if I could, sorry to keep talking here, but also add that much of the research that's coming out in the last several years is looking at when is our nitrate actually leaving the system, and it's typically between harvest and plant. So harvest, times where there's not a living root or a growing crop on a field, that's where we're seeing some of the largest load or largest loss of nitrate. And if we can narrow that window down and apply tools to help mitigate that, maybe we can have a greater percent reduction or a greater impact on it.
No more questions? I have one. In my first research with I noticed the map that Heather put up on geology. I was born in Juneau County, towards the southern part of the state. And my understanding is that the aquifer, one of Wisconsin's aquifer, starts way up here in the sand area. And I can attest that Juneau County is sand, sand, and more sand. That aquifer stretches way down to almost the bottom of Juneau County, if not more. And if you look at that as a big picture, it wasn't that long ago that there were some residents in Juneau County that had to have bottled water because their wells were completely contaminated. I don't have an update on that now, but I am assuming Juneau County is primarily agriculture, and thank God for the national forests down there. Is there a source that looks at the major aquifers of Wisconsin and some characteristics or problems or solutions that have evolved through the years on the individual aquifers?
I would say that in general, yes, like state hydrogeologists and geologists are looking at that and have an understanding of the aquifer. And I guess what comes to mind is and this has been my experience, and not stating this as your perspective, Terry, but there's been perspectives where people feel that the water beneath our feet here in Dunn County is water that has come from Lake Superior or come from a larger distance than us locally. So that came to mind when you mentioned aquifer. Yes, we are in the same sandstone geology as Juneau County. And yes, it might be a sandstone aquifer, but the water that we're pulling out of the ground in Dunn County is water that came typically within the Dunn County region. It had fallen on the landscape, it had infiltrated, percolated through the sandstone aquifer, and then is withdrawn either up through wells that we've drilled, or it is discharged to surface water, springs, that sort of thing. The water that is in that sandstone aquifer here in Dunn County is likely not contributing to well contamination in the sandstone aquifer in Juneau County. So, but with that said, I mean, yes, hydrogeologists are aware of that and monitor that all the time. And I think it's a characteristic of the geology of the sandstone as to how fast water infiltrates and moves through that sandstone in that aquifer. And it's somewhat uniform across the state in that respect, but it still is not a good indicator for why a particular well might be contaminated here at Dunn County.
Thank you.
Well, we'd like to thank you guys for being here tonight. It's 8:30. We think we better let you go. Thank you so much for presenting and putting the slideshow together. We greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having us. And like I said, we might not have all the answers, and we're certainly a resource for all of you and to continue along the path, and we'll try to do the best we can to help you out and find information and just hope that you know that we do have an interest in groundwater. And while we might be slow at implementation and might be limited in some of our authorities, but we do have a concern for it, and we're hoping to continue our work in the capacity that we have to try to help citizens out. So,
You
It's
know,
exciting.
I just want to echo the thank you. And Chase and Heather, if there's something that we can do on the local level, would you let us know?
Share your data.
That will do.
I appreciate that.
Well, yeah.
No, but thank you guys for having us. Like Chase said, if there's any questions or anything, don't hesitate to reach out to any one of us.
Okay, thank you.
Stop sharing.
Let's, if you could just make me the host now, Kathy, when you're done taping, and then we'll continue our meeting briefly.